Okay, welcome to the October 3rd Dev Call. We are doing it off cycle this week because we had Dev Day in person in LA last week, so we bumped the meetings off schedule by a week, but we will be back to our regular schedule. So there'll be another meeting next week on October 10th, and then we'll kind of go back to every 2 weeks. Cool. We wanted to take a slightly different POV on the agenda this week. We talked a little bit about this at Dev Day. We wanted to recap it for all the folks who couldn't make it and talk more about like our high level priorities and all the different bets that we're making across Forecast and Farcaster. So we're gonna maybe talk a little more than we usually do in terms of going through these priorities. If you've been to Dev Day, you may have heard some of this before, but we'll have some new updates on how our thinking has been updated over the last week. So high level, we want to walk through these things. We did, Dan sent out a survey a few weeks ago to all the developers, and the universal feedback on priorities were number one is growth. And so we're going to talk about that and the two bets that we're making with frames and channels. The third priority there are a bunch of sub priorities around frames and channels. We're kind of all bundling them into one. But the next one in the priority stack was direct casts, specifically around extending the APIs, making it more interoperable. So we'll talk through that as well. Third was reducing sign-up costs, which we heard from a few new applications that have been trying to onboard users. Fourth is stability of hubs and improvements around sync health. And 5 is getting more on-chain data onto the protocol. And we have a couple of proposals, some from the community about locations, which we'll talk through. And 6 was sign in with Farcaster. So we'll go ahead and kind of go through all of this. There's a lot to get through today, so I will try to keep the meeting moving just to make sure we touch on all the important points and don't get stuck on one. But if we don't get to anything today, we'll also take questions offline. And again, we'll have a call next week to go over anything that we don't finish. With that, let me turn it over to Dan to talk through growth and through the channels and frame stuff, particularly the channels launch, which is happening tomorrow.
Right. So two primary areas focused on from a team standpoint, like for growth is one, channels, and then 2, frames. We have it in the other order, so I'll just do frames quickly. Mini apps are out. The documentation is still in Notion, kind of in progress. Horsefax actually was on vacation for part of this week, so we haven't made a ton of progress since we launched last week, right before Dev Day. But the goal here is to kind of get feedback and prioritization based off of the people building mini apps and kind of like what they want. I think one top priority thing outside of like cleaner documentation and like clearer understanding of like how do I actually make a mini app work, which we need to rebrand Composer Actions, and there's a bunch of cleanup there. But I think that the big thing is transaction support in frames. So thinking through the security implications of that. And yeah, so I think we're going to kind of revisit that probably tomorrow after channels launches, and then have a clear set of priorities for next week. I think as it relates to channels, we rolled out the new UI for feeds, which is kind of like setting the foundation for the switch to channels, got rid of the channel circles, made the channel label more visible. We've been piloting this for 3 weeks internally and done a bunch of iterations. Actually, Blockheim had a nice cast storm if you want to kind of go see some of the iterations that we lived with. But ultimately, what we found is we find ourselves tapping into the channel pages a lot more often. And with the change flipping over tomorrow, the feeds will actually be, reverse cron. So there's kind of always something hopefully new, assuming you're in an active channel. We are going to ship the new version of channels tomorrow. The APIs are live. I know Airstack and Hypersub are both like kind of already starting to do moderation, cleaning up member roles for their channels. And then I know Howl is working on Modbot, which is now a fork of the original AutoMod. So there's probably going to be some bumpiness that naturally, but I think like we're doing as much as we can to make it smooth. And then assuming everything rolls out smoothly, starting next week, I think we're going to be shifting over to how do you onboard a user directly to your channel? So that is a kind of like, how do we make onboarding streamlined within Warpcast? And in doing so, kind of thinking through like, how do we make this available throughout the protocol? So I think like it's very much of, okay, we have the new primitive, like people understand how it works, they're set up. Okay, how do you grow your channel and your community? And so that's where we're going to be shifting from a channel standpoint. Any feedback? Okay. We have a lot of topics today, so I think like if it's nothing like super critical, we should just keep moving.
Okay. Cool. No questions at all. Great. We'll go on to direct cast, which is the next topic. So high level, one of the things we've noticed over the last few months is the number of programmable DCs are growing. A bunch of folks building in the ecosystem, Moxie, Eventcaster, so on, have been using it to send notifications, and we're generally seeing more and more people get excited about this. So we have two focuses here. One is the short term, we want to improve programmability, which to us means the ability to read and write direct cast. So today you can only send a message on behalf of an account that you control. And the change we want to make is let you also read messages before you send responses. So this actually goes from this sort of one-way push notification to actually being able to have a conversation with the user and do interesting things like manage support through a channel and other kinds of interactions. You can also imagine like plugging in LLM and starting to do interesting things there. So that's going to be the number one focus, because this seems like something that is growing fast and is easy to implement and is important for developers. Expect something in the next few months around this that we will ship. The longer term plan is interoperability. And so that means like actually getting DirectCast to work across multiple clients. This is a really hard problem. Like we've spent probably about 2-person years polishing our DC experience, getting all the details to work, from messages to performance to groups to reactions to replies and all the little details. And putting out a version of APIs and saying, hey, everybody else just go build all this stuff doesn't seem like the right trade-off to make. I think we will end up with a subpar user experience. We'll end up with people building experiences where one half of the chat feels broken, or we'll just end up with app developers just being like, I don't want to do the work to build all of this stuff. And so we think we actually have to do some infrastructural work to give people better building blocks to be able to do this. It's not yet clear what the right path to doing this is. We can explore building libraries and SDKs. We can explore other interesting things like being able to drop in frames or things where we build components for you that you can just plug and play. But it's more of a research project than here's a clear thing, go and just ship this tomorrow. So sometime in 2025, we hope to get to a point where we have interoperability. As soon as we're done with programming, we're going to start thinking about interop and working on that next. Beyond that, the two other things that we want to do but are in the post-2025 plans are encryption and decentralization. And encryption for us means end-to-end encryption, so only clients have access to the messages and all the servers in between don't have access to it. And decentralization means there's no reliance on a single Warpcast server. But these are frankly lower in the priority stack, both for our users, and they're much harder to build. The reason being there are pretty good alternatives for encryption out there, like Signal, which we recommend people use if they want encrypted messaging. And we really want to focus on programmability. That's the unique thing that sets us apart, this ability that when someone interacts with you on chain, you can find their Farcaster ID, send them a request, and actually interact with them through the app. That's like the really powerful thing that we think DMs are enabling today, and that's what we want to double down on. Okay, let me pause there. I know Gabriel and Goksu, who've been working on this, are on the call today. So if folks have any questions, please post it in the chat or raise it now. Cool. So there's a question on what's the current stand on DC interoperability using XMTP. So one of the things that matters to us in terms of what users are asking for is a certain level of feature parity with Telegram. The biggest reason that many users churned from DCs earlier this year was like, hey, it's hard to manage groups, it's hard to pin folders, it's hard to do all of this stuff. We think that that's the minimum bar for DCs to work, like just to be passable and to even retain people on this platform. And that's what we're focused on. We're philosophically open to the idea of integrating XMTP, but the reality is group messaging is still in beta. There's a lot of stuff there that doesn't quite work as well as DCs and Warpcast. And once that bar is met, we're open to reconsidering it. But the answer is probably not today or in the next 2 to 3 months. Cool. The other thing worth mentioning, just philosophically, how we think about like direct messaging is like in a social network, I think every social network will have its own messaging product, right? You have these sort of general purpose messaging platforms like Telegram and Signal that everybody uses, but the main benefit of having something built into Farcaster is when you are doing stuff in Farcaster, you can actually communicate with people without leaving the app. And so that's kind of the thing that we're focused on as the first value prop, and then programmability and being able to reach users and talk to them is the second. And we're going to really double down on that for the rest of this year. Final call, if you have any use cases for programmable DCs, in particular, if there are things you want to do with write APIs that you can't do today, or if there are things that you would do with read APIs that you are very interested in exploring, please let me or Gabriel or Goksu know. We would love to get more feedback from you now as we get into the design phase the next few weeks. Okay. Next topic is reducing sign-up costs. So our goal for Farcaster signups is getting to $1 by next year, and we think that's very viable. We just cut it to $2 a few weeks ago, and we're going to keep pushing the needle and bringing it down. The biggest reason we can't bring it down immediately is helping apps overcome spam. Every time sign-up costs go down, the number of spammy accounts signing up go up, and this creates a tax on the entire ecosystem. Not just on Warpcast, but pretty much we are hearing from a lot of developers that they're now less likely to index data and less likely to run hubs and stream all the data because it's getting expensive to index all these spammy users. And there's no good way for them to filter this out of their Postgres databases and avoid paying the costs. So we do need to level up our spam infrastructure and build better tools there. But we're pretty confident that we can get this down to $1 by next year. The other thing we've heard and we want to offer clients is if you are thinking of signing up users and your biggest concern is, hey, I don't want to be paying for a sign up fee. I'm bringing on good users and I don't want to be paying the sign up fee. Reach out to us. We are happy to work out something where we can help subsidize good users that you are bringing on and signing up. I think the nuance will be in the details. And one thing we want to be transparent about is like defining good users is very hard. And it's something that we'll have to flesh out. But if that's the primary thing stopping you from bringing people onto the protocol today, we're happy to work through, and you can message Dan or myself and we can talk through that. Cool. Question in the chat. What do you see as the blocker to making it free? Even $1 is a huge difference for well-intentioned users and seems like not that much for someone running farming bots. So the first level is we're going to need an on-chain transaction to set up an account. So there's always going to be some cost. Today, that's maybe 15 cents, fluctuates between 5 and 30 cents, but there's always going to be an on-chain cost and someone has to pay it. App developers can sponsor it if they're able to qualify the users, or they have to pass it on to the user. So you can sort of think of the 15 cents as the floor today, and maybe that goes down with increasing number of, as blockchains get better and faster and so on. The challenge is, well, we know what happens when we don't charge a storage fee. That's actually kind of how we launched the contracts. We let you sign up and create an account that you could just do for 15 cents. What immediately happened was someone figured out a way to create 150,000 accounts for a few cents, or for like a few dollars, and they did that. And that immediately imposed a large tax on the system, right? Now, every hub was adding 150,000 accounts, and someone could easily spend $50,000 and create a bunch of junk accounts. And now you're flooding database tables and hubs and other things for no cost. And this is when we sort of allowed you to just register an account without storage. So you could just get this account ID and you wouldn't be able to post messages, but you just have it. And so I think the challenge with it is there's going to be some dollar amount or some threshold at which people will show up and just start spamming the network. And we need to figure out what that is, and we need to get like numbers, like there's two paths to it. One is keep reducing costs until we hit that threshold where we feel pretty good about like, hey, this is a low enough cost, maybe 20, 30, 50 cents that users are onboarding, and get people there. Beyond that, I think if you genuinely want a system where anybody can sign up for free, you have to explore models where it is possible for operators or people on the network to be able to choose whose data they sync. And this starts getting really messy, right? Because at this point, you could post on, like, let's say Warpcast decides you're a good user and Supercast doesn't, or vice versa. You end up in all these frustrating situations where you post on one app and it doesn't show up on the other app. And that actually is like a really big problem. Like users would get really upset if they're on one but not on the other. And so I do think that some level of cost and global access, which is the guarantee that you get on every app in the network, is a significantly better user experience than no cost. And the thing that I think apps will be able to do is you can get really smart at qualifying your users, and you can take away the cost or pay the cost or cover the cost. Like if you have someone signing up who has an account on Twitter with X thousand followers, you should be like, great, I've acquired a valuable user. Let me pay your 50-cent sign up fee and get you on board. I think this is valuable. Whereas if you get somebody with no credentials and nothing, you're like, okay, you've got to pay to prove some baseline. Okay.
Varun, do you mind if I add just one point?
Yeah, please.
So I think this is something Varun and I have spent a lot of time talking over lunch. We get lunch every day and talk about some topic. I think we both have a pretty strong belief that we're kind of on the edge because of the EV positive nature of like signing up for a crypto-based social network. Every single social network is going to either have to have some proof of humanity equivalent, which even doesn't solve the spam issue, or a fee. And Elon's already kind of hinted at this in terms of changing right access on Twitter. With AI, it is only going to get more difficult to not handle bots. And so the only levers you're going to have are some proof of like, friction to preventing AIs from signing up, and then cost. And that cost ideally gets redirected into a more productive use case for the network. So any version of the world where we say, oh, well, we just need to get signups for free and then we'll grow like Web 2, that's an outdated model of thinking from the early era of social networks before things got really sophisticated from spam bots, AI network. It's like just not ever going to happen again. And so we need to get to in public broadcast social networks. Obviously, messaging or kind of like smaller networks they don't have that issue because you don't necessarily interact with spam. But I really, really believe that the whole world will head this way. And so I think we just have to figure out like what are the creative strategies, assuming that there will always be some level of cost in order for the network to remain permissionless.
Yep. There's a question on what are the actual way to reduce signup costs. So there's two components to the signup cost. One is the on-chain fee, which is just the transaction that you need to make to get things on-chain. That's defined by Base and, Optimism, Mainnet, or whatever chain we happen to be on. And the second is the storage fee that we impose on top of the transaction fee. This is set by the Farcaster protocol, controlled by the smart contracts, and is something that we have the ability to move up and down through a multi-sig wallet. Cool. Last call for questions on this before we move on to hubs. Okay, great. So first thing on hubs, team is still actively tackling ongoing stability issues this week. The root cause is we're noticing that our hubs specifically, are running out of memory and restarting. Very often under some RPC patterns, just as the network has gotten bigger and we're doing larger and larger calls to reconcile stuff. And the side effect of that is when the restarts happen, messages get delayed. So you'll see some messages come in and take like a minute or 5 minutes. You may see 95% of messages go through with no delay whatsoever. Obviously, this is frustrating, and we are working on fixing this and patching this in the current system as quickly as possible. The real root cause of why this is happening and like why we're actually putting excessive load on our hubs is because there is no good way to sync our database to the hubs because we don't have any sort of ordering or any sort of block model. Whenever we're like, let's see if we've missed any messages, we have to run this very expensive query to iterate over all the messages we've received in the last few days and all the messages the hubs have and sort through the millions of items to see, did we miss anyone? And this is sort of an unsustainable pattern. Like this whole problem of there is no ordering comes up in many ways. It's why hubs don't sync quickly when they talk to each other. And it's been a great design to get us from 0 to 1 million users, but it's not going to be the design that gets us from 1 million users to 10 million users and beyond. And so the big thing that we're working on is a new version of hub sync called Snapchain. There's been a pretty active discussion. You can open up this GitHub thread for all the different ideas that are being proposed and all the conversations that have happened. I won't rehash where we are, but the update from our side is Sanjay and the team are exploring a new iteration of Snapchain. We posted one iteration here. We'll have another doc out this week with some updates about how we're thinking about the new model. And there are also alternative proposals. I know Vraipan has a block proposal that he's got in here that he's been pushing and refining with some folks. So if you're interested in distributed system problems, or if you run a hub and you have opinions on what you care about, please make sure you voice your things either directly in this GitHub issue, or you can always DM me and we'll factor all of this into our thinking. Our perspective on how we want to approach this is in the next week or two, we want to lock down on a design. We're actively prototyping Snapchain, and that's actually brought up some issues with the consensus algorithm. So we're feeding that back into the design. And hopefully by some point in October, we will have a clear timeline for, hey, here's when the new version is going to ship, and here's how the migration is going to happen. We think the migration will generally be smooth and require maybe a small amount of downtime that can be scheduled. So there may be a few hours when casts are not like flowing freely between apps, but we can figure out a time and place for that to happen. Other than that, we think it will be largely like smooth transition of data from one to the other. Cool. Cool. Big ask for folks is when we have the new rev of the docs later this week. Yeah, please take a look at it. It's going to have some significant changes from the last version based on feedback from users and things we've learned in prototyping, and help us refine that design as we get to completion. If you're also interested in contributing to SnapChain, if you're experienced in writing Rust or distributed systems in general, we would love to have more people help us as we build this out. So feel free to reach out to me or Sanjay, and we can talk through stuff. Great. Any questions on hubs before we go to locations? Cool. Locations. We actually have two FIPs up for discussion, and let me summarize both at a high level. The first one is location on profile. So this is about adding location to the user data. So the very high level idea is apps can ask users, hey, would you like to share your location? And users can say, yes, I'm in Los Angeles or I'm in San Francisco, and they can put in this information and it will show up publicly on their profile. It's opt-in, so only users that choose to do it will do it. And it can be used for a bunch of location-based features, like helping you search for other users in your area, letting you know when someone you follow visits your city, et cetera, et cetera. So people who want to be discovered and want to meet other people will find this like useful. Warpcast already has this feature. Many of you have seen it. We just have not made it part of the protocol. And this change is going to make it an actual primitive in the protocol, and Warpcast will then publish all of its data to the protocol. Second point on this is how are we going to represent location? There's a few different standards and formats. The team went through it all. We kind of looked at two different formats, geohashing and latitude, longitude. We went with latitude, longitude, mostly because it's more supported in lots of libraries. And there's largely a 1-to-1-ish conversion between lat long and geohashing. So it's very easy to transfer stuff to geohashing back. The reason we didn't go with geohashing is because there is no single global standard for geohashing. There's like 3 substandards and you have to pick one of them. And there's not good libraries in all languages for all standards. So it's better to start with lat long and let people translate down. The other decision we made is to limit precision. So we're allowing 2 decimal places of precision, which is roughly speaking a 1 kilometer radius that you'll know around where someone is. And the reason we're enforcing this even at the protocol level is I think it's going to be far too easy for someone to accidentally upload a sensitive location, like the location of their home or something like that. And because all this data is on an open protocol that's easily indexable, someone could build a service that archives everything forever, and you might post your home location permanently, which would be very frustrating. Again, no app would do this intentionally, but yeah, accidentally, this is very likely to happen. And so rounding to 2 decimal places gives us a lot of precision. Like 1 kilometer is pretty good for matching location-based services and stuff like that, but allows people to preserve the privacy of exact locations. Cool. Let me see if there's any questions in chat we should talk through. There's a note there about 11 kilometers. We've actually added 2 decimal places, which I believe brings it down to 1 square kilometer then. So it's no longer 11, because when we did the 11, we noticed that some locations were not translating correctly when we went back and forth to different APIs. Yes, it's 1.1 to be precise. Cool. How's this guaranteed at the protocol level? Isn't it just a string field? So the proposal is to actually validate the format and the length. So I believe the latest thinking is that it will be a geo hash of the format geo colon followed by, some digits, decimal place 2 digits, some digits, decimal place 2 digits, maybe a comma separated in the middle. There's still some fiddling with the exact thing, but the hubs will actually validate that the data follows that format and that you only have 2 digits of precision. So it's not just an unbounded string. We have this in a bunch of places. For example, like usernames on the protocol and Solidity, we have string matching and stuff. So their string validation is a thing that we do for better type data at the protocol level. Cool. Any questions? Great. Second proposal, very related. Christopher actually proposed also adding location at the cast level. And so this is to enable a slightly different set of features, like if you're building stories or things where you want to advertise a location or you want to match things on a more go forward basis. Using the user's profile might not make sense, especially if people are traveling and doing stuff. And I really like this idea. It's using the same, ideally, we want to use the same format of data, so the same geo-lat-long construct, but we actually want to include this in the embed message. So actually be able to put it as an embed in a cast. So instead of a link or a frame, you can actually have a location, and then clients can choose to display that in whatever way they like. So part of this proposal is ironing out the details for how we do it, whether it's a separate type or whether it's a string that we parse. We want to work through some of the details here. But in general, we're fans of this proposal. Warpcast will support it. We have to figure out the UI that we will ship to render this, which we haven't done yet. But this is the other proposal, which is adding location data at the cast level. Cool. Great. One note on this, we haven't made as much progress on the location spec in the last 2 days because the team has been firefighting hub issues. So we're going to make that our top priority, and we're going to come back and make a little more progress on this once we've been able to stabilize that. Question from Christopher.
Yeah, I think that there is an opportunity. I think you mentioned before to put URIs instead of URLs as embeds, and I think that there's a huge opportunity for that. I think this is a good test to see if location URIs are actually going to be used by clients downstream of that. But is there thinking that we will trend to that and then deprecate the geo URI in the future, or consider the geo URI as a dedicated slot separate from the limit of 2 on embeds?
The high level thinking right now is we want to keep the limit of 2 on embeds. Just because it gets harder and harder for clients on mobile and other devices to render arbitrary bits of data if they don't know how things are sized. But we're thinking about swapping one of like you can choose to include a geolocation instead of a picture, for example, when you do that. So you can use one geo, one image, one geo, one frame, or you can use 2 images and whatnot. The thing that we want to think through, and I think you had this in your proposal, is the geo a narrow and distinct type, which means that like at the protobuf level, it's actually just very specifically, this is a geo, here's how you parse it. Or do we have a more generic thing, which is like you can add URIs, and the first one we support is geo, but if you wanted to invent new URI standards in the future, you can kind of go invent and add that stuff in there. The trade-offs in my mind right now are like the flexibility of URIs are great, but the reality is if people just start putting random URIs and Warpcast doesn't support them, no one's going to use them. And so we actually need to coordinate a little bit on what the standard is and make sure everyone's bought into rendering them before we do it. And if we're doing that anyway, then the flexibility of URI doesn't matter. So maybe we should do the top. We also wanted to do some analysis on what is the most compact format for data storage and see like, is that trivial? Does it matter? Like, is encoding it as a string versus a protobuf? Are there any storage savings versus complexity trade-offs there? So there's just a few open questions we want to figure out before we say this is a final. Okay, cool. I'm going to look through the embeds. We have not thought deeply about increasing the number of embeds. The thinking when we picked 2, which was a few years ago when we finalized the protocol, was 2 was easy to render in most places. It was embeds also have a cost on the size of the data. But if there's a good case for 4, if there's like particular data that people want to create that's there, we're open to considering a proposal. It would require non-trivial client work for Warpcast and for other things. So we'd want to make sure that this is not just like a nice to have, but something that is actually like very important before we can to doing this refactor. Great. Any other questions from folks? Okay, I'm just going through chat. Question on priorities. Looks like that's answered. All right, getting back to this. Last one is on sign-in with Farcaster. This is not actively being worked on right now. Horsefax is actually working on some higher order problems, which is getting people who've created accounts on other applications to be able to import their seed trade into Warpcast. That's what we're going to fix right now. But the overall thinking is we want to get to a point later this year where sign-in with Farcaster works on web. So you're actually going to be able to sign in from web to web without having to go back to your mobile device. The reason this is not trivial is because right now sign in with Farcaster is built around sign in with Ethereum, and your Ethereum key only exists on your mobile device today. So we either have to figure out some way to be able to get that signature from desktop, either by proxying to mobile, or by inventing a new standard that actually uses signers so that you might have access to it on your desktop and do that. So there's still some technical design to be done there. Once that's done, the broader thinking is to also get to multi-client. Those two might actually be related because if we move to a signer or EDDSA based standard, we might actually make it easier to do this from other clients like Supercast. But in terms of implementation sequencing, we'll likely do web first and then multi-client after. Cool. Dan, anything you wanted to add on signing with Farcaster?
No, but just to kind of reiterate to Jason, I think one piece of feedback coming out of the dev meeting was maybe align what our priorities are and then just give updates on priorities for these dev meetings. And so I think we're going to kind of iterate a little bit. Whereas before we used to just come with the diff of like, here's literally the things we think are relevant versus at least every other meeting, put it that way, of just like making sure everyone understands like there's a public doc of the priorities and then any updates specific to that. But really just trying to align the 14 people we have at Merkle of like, literally, these are the things we're working on. In the case of signing with Farcaster, it was an item that came up, but like, actually it's below the line in the sense of, I guess that's the Chamath phrase, but it's like no one's working on signing with Farcaster right now.
Cool. We actually got through that agenda pretty quickly. So if folks have any other open questions or topics, we got a few more minutes, happy to discuss them. If not, we'll wrap this early and give you all 10 minutes back. Yeah, Zinger, I think that's a good suggestion of like extending embeds by type. Like that might be the way to get to 4 embeds, because there was a joke earlier about 4 frames in a cast might look a little weird in a feed. But there's a version where we say that like, hey, you're allowed to have 4 images or 3 images in a location, but not 4 frames. So that might actually be a smart way to start bringing in a little more flexibility into the protocol level. The one minor challenge with embeds is like they're actually pretty sizable in terms of data. Like each embed is like 256 bytes, which is usually more than the length of the cast itself in terms of how much you're allowed to store. And so it does become a vector for spam. Now, fortunately, we haven't had malicious actors who come in and try to just like max throw junk on the network by filling in all of their embed slots. But there is a world where if you say we allow 4 embeds with images, each cast is now potentially a maximum size of 1 kilobyte or more than 1 kilobyte. And then we have to start reducing the number of casts people can have. That might actually be a valid trade-off, right? Like it may be totally okay to go fewer on casts, but we should actually reconsider this. But it is likely below this list in terms of priority. I think the team is fully stacked in terms of 1 through 5. So want to be clear that we will probably only get to this later this year, early next year. Cool. Going through the other questions. About ordering and storage. Brightpan, I don't know if I caught that question or if that was in relation to something I said. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah. So there is something that I think we should take into account and start thinking about. If we have ordering, then the state of each hub is not important in the sense that the hubs, even if my hub throws away a lot of data, it won't affect how it syncs with the rest of the network, right? Because there is ordering and hubs know what they're missing, etc. Right now, I can't throw away some of the data or keep more data because there will be a problem syncing the CRDTs. So if we are in a network where the state of each hub is not guaranteed, then how does this affect storage units? I mean, right now, the network actually provides some assurances to users that some data will be stored in all hubs based on some rules. If this is not the case, what is the case? I mean, there are a lot of ways to approach this, and some may be better or worse, but I think this is something that we should have in mind, and it may also affect the cost of its user.
Yeah, I think this is a good point. Here's kind of how we're thinking about it on day 1. So at launch, there will be validators, which are producing blocks and sort of have this access to create the blocks. And there will be hubs which are syncing all the data from these validators. So these are hubs that will actually sync every FID, they'll sync every bit of data, and they are responsible for having all of the data. So they do not get to say, hey, I don't want to choose X data or I don't want to choose Y data. Separately, we can introduce a new class of hubs. You can think of them as light clients, where they can actually make the decision to say, I don't want to sync FID X and Y. You know what, like my application only cares about these 3 accounts. Let me just sync this data. for the P2P mesh to work correctly, you can't arbitrarily sync with a light client. Like if all of your peers end up being hubs that only have a fraction of the data, you actually can't get the data. So we need a tight inner mesh that has all the users that are like, hey, I'm willing to sync a large chunk of or all the data. And those will be hubs as we know them today. And in the future, we might be able to introduce a new class on the side where you can run these like read hubs. They will likely sort of mostly be fetching from the network, but they won't actually be contributing to the sync of the network because we have no guarantee on whether they have 1% of the data or 90% of the data. And for most people trying to fetch data, talking to them will just end up being useless. So I think storage in its current form will remain and will largely be similar to what it is today, which is we still require a large percentage of hubs to actually have all the data and to validate all the data to act as a check against validator collusion. Because if you don't have any hubs that have the full data, if all 10 validators collude, they could actually like publish something or censor something, or publish an invalid block. But if you actually have a large network of hubs, they can cause a chain halt, and so validators obviously won't be able to do that. So we do need hubs that are sequencing large chunks of the data as it goes. Did that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, sort of. But the only assurance in this is that I'm not modifying the hub that I'm running. There's no protocol level assurance. I mean, no one is checking if I'm actually storing the data or not.
That's true, but isn't that true of every node? Like that's true of Hubble today, that's true of an Ethereum node today.
Right now, if I modify my state, I can't sync with the rest. And if I insist in not having the full state, I will not be able to sync with the rest of the hubs.
Sure, you will be able to sync. You could easily write a rule in your Hubble right now that says, I would like to ignore every cast from Dan Romero, and your Hubble would sync fine with everybody else. It's just that when you start syncing Dan's data, there would be an error, right? And we have this notion of peer scoring that's like loosely enforced that says, hey, if you don't have it, we'll like catch it over time. But the reality is you can actually modify Ethereum nodes and Bitcoin nodes to have them do all kinds of weird things. But there are some consistency and validity checks that you implement at the node level that says, hey, if a node is faulty, like it keeps doing weird things repeatedly, then just like stop listening to it on the peer-to-peer network. And so it'll be that same kind of guarantee across everything, which is if you want to be a hub, not a light hub, which has some set of the data, but a true hub, there's an expectation that you have all the data. And if a hub is syncing with you and it repeatedly fails to sync from you, but it's able to sync with two other parties, it's eventually going to lower and lower your peer score and just kind of go, okay, something's wrong with this. Either the network's not working or it's failing or it's not responding. I'm just going to start ignoring this hub. And that's very similar to how ETH, Bitcoin, and most P2P networks work is there's always faulty nodes, and it's not always easy to tell the difference between a malfunctioning node and a malicious node. So you have to have some system for identifying and ignoring the malicious nodes, the malfunctioning nodes of the network hub. There is actually an interesting point on storage, which is storage does get, which you were saying, Brad Penn, which storage does get a little bit more efficient. We no longer have to hold delete messages because with ordering and with pruning, we'll actually be able to, after some time has passed, prune delete messages. So if that actually pans out to reducing storage characteristics, that might be another thing where we can go and increase storage limits or reduce storage costs or do something there that meaningfully helps the network. So there might be some improvements, but we actually have to game out how that works once we build the system. Cool. There are a few more questions, so let me try to get through them. Timing for the launch, Dan confirms that it's at 1 p.m. Pacific tomorrow. Should we revisit the external data FIP? Right, Ben, I think that's right. Before we do a bunch of work on that, though, I think it might make sense to do it a little later once the team actually has gotten through some of these priorities, so we can actually give you good feedback on that. But I think there's a version of like updating the embeds to do something more interesting here. Cool. Going through the comments. Yeah, there's a bug from Steven. When user imports their private key, Warpcast, there was an exception. That is what Horsefax is working on this week. That's the top priority bug that we're trying to fix. So we will hopefully have that result soon. What's the general idea of snap block time? So there's actually two answers to this. One is I think that like most people will not notice delays of up to a minute because of how feed generation works on app. Like when you we are not generating your feed in real time. It's just crazy expensive to be like every second regenerate a whole feed for every user. So we actually like sort of back off based on how often the user lands, and roughly we might regenerate it 20 seconds for an active user or minutes for inactive users in some cases. And I think that would likely be true of most applications at scale. So you kind of have a tolerance of a minute before people start noticing that something is slow. So 15 seconds is actually going to be pretty fast and is going to be better than today. So in today's world, like, yes, you can immediately publish a message to Hub and it's picked up, but our P99 guarantee is actually 1 minute because of the way sync works and the way the CRDTs work. There can be lossiness, there can be slowness. And so today I would actually think of the P99 as 1 minute. And with SnapChain, with the current proposal, we think the P99 is definitely going to be 15 seconds. So it's going to be a huge improvement in how fast CAS moves through the network. That said, we actually think we can get much faster block times. Like, theoretically, we could get sub-second or even close to a second in some cases. And so we might be in a world where we get much, much faster than 15 seconds. We just don't want to overpromise before actually prototyping, building, and testing that. 15 is something we can definitely achieve and we think is a definite improvement. So that's kind of the benchmark now. When we get through a round of prototyping, we may come back and say, hey, actually 5 seconds is what we can do. Let's go more aggressive. Cool. Okay, great. No other questions here. So unless I missed anything or anyone wants to ask any last questions, we will wrap here perfectly on time. So thank you, everyone. And we'll be back next Thursday with more questions. So if there's any things people have on channels post-launch or any of these Hub, SnapChain or the FIP locations, we'll discuss them next week. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you all soon.